Hello and welcome to the Tucson Bitcoin podcast. Today I have on Erik Cason, who describes himself as a crypto anarchist. He's definitely has a cypherpunk philosophy in life, and it was just an awesome conversation talking about the importance of Bitcoin, what anarchism really is. There's a lot of misconceptions on it. The news will oftentimes just character assassinate anarchists, and I thought it's kind of a cool ideology that really seeks to empower people, and there's a lot of misconceptions, and I wanted to get some anarchists on the show that also were Bitcoiners to talk about it and talk about how it could impact society. But yeah, it was a fun conversation, and I took a lot away from it. And if you like what we're doing, please consider supporting me on Patreon at the Tucson Bitcoin podcast. I hope you enjoy the interview. Well, welcome, Erik. Good to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you are a self-described crypto anarchist. So what does that mean?
To me, it means utilizing cryptography in order to try to get ourselves closer to achieving an anarchist society. And to me, that doesn't mean, chaos and lawlessness everywhere. It simply means without rulers, and I think people are very capable of organizing themselves and helping one another, specifically like when they have understandable and thoughtful rules that make sense according to whatever's going on. And essentially, Bitcoin cryptography, in my mind, is a way that we can rebuild society using the internet and strong privacy protection to essentially try to reorganize the world from top to bottom, and we're at the very beginning stages of that, of which, in my opinion, Bitcoin's kind of the harbinger of the entire movement because it gives us a shilling point to sort of meet up at.
Yeah, definitely. There's a misconception with anarchism for some reason. Well, I mean, I think the reason would be pretty obvious in the sense of like it challenges the authority of the state, and the state doesn't like that. But people tend to think, like you said, kind of alluded to, but people tend to think of anarchism as just like chaos. And you did a real good definition of what anarchism is. Uh, what led you to become to kind of think this way and feel like there was an other option than government?
So I was pretty deeply involved in the Occupy Wall Street movement. I was pretty far left at the point in time, and I would identify as like a socialist, maybe a communist in some contexts. And through the process of going through Wall Street, I was introduced to anarchism. I had kind of the same ideas about it, like it was like destroy everything and light it on fire and let chaos reign. And I talked to a few people who were like, no, that's not it at all. You should do a little more research, try to figure it out more. And as I watched kind of the Occupy movement devolve and sort of hamstring itself from its original cause, I started to do more research around anarchism, and I realized that uh, there was this way to try to achieve a stateless society without essentially needing to like hijack the state and make a dictatorship of the proletariat. And that's sort of what anarchism was all about, was like, look, we can create these new societies together and work together, but the moment that we start trying to hijack the state and utilizing it, like that goes really bad. And essentially the 20th century is a story about what happens when you get radical socialists that make a choice to hijack the state and try to implement communism, and it's gone over pretty poorly. With that being said, it's pretty clear to me that the state is radically overpowered and has created a form of life that's pretty undesirable for most people. And from my readings of reading kind of classic anarchist theorists like Bakunin and Rudolf Rocker, it really resonated with me, and I was like, oh, this is a way that people can subjectively choose to voluntarily participate in new organizational structures that can allow for them to help each other and offer mutual assistance to one another. And then at the same time, it was serendipitous enough that somebody in the Occupy movement told me about Bitcoin, and this was like very early on, and I still had a hard time kind of understanding it. But I remember there was a distinct point in time where I had a light bulb of, I was like, oh, it's the money. Like if we can do something about the money, like this object that we all use every day to, organize our economic lives, we can make a really substantial impact and change. And I guess at that point, that's kind of when the light bulb went off, and I was like, oh, like it's crypto anarchy, and then I started reading kind of Timothy May's stuff and Cryptonomicon, and from there, I just kind of started eating it all up.
Yeah. As far as the Occupy Wall Street movement, is there still some remnants of that, or did it pretty much fizzle out?
I mean, I think all the activists that were involved kind of went in their various directions to kind of fight for different causes and things. And, I do think a lot of it fizzled out. I remember actually seeing something recently, like one of the prime organizers of Occupy Wall Street, he like went on to be like a marketing manager at like Uber or something. And like that's kind of a great example of like the way that, um, yeah, like the trying to fight for your rights against the state directly, in my opinion, like it's a loveless task and an erroneous uh, quest. Like it's impossible to try to fight the state head on, and that's one of the things about Bitcoin that I find really exciting is it's this sly roundabout way to essentially attack the state without them fully understanding it. And I have this whole thing I like to talk about that, like essentially like Bitcoin's a Trojan horse, and the way that and blockchain too, because like people are like, look, like you can use all these blockchains for this good stuff, but like on the back end, there's like all of this high powered cryptography that like when implemented and utilized correctly, like you become self sovereign. And so I think it's a really exciting time because essentially the failures that anarchism had in the earliest 20th century that made it scum both to socialism and to fascism on the far right. A lot of it was the actual like techniques of organization, which essentially cryptography and Bitcoin and all of these new methodologies of organization solve in a really powerful way. So I think there's a much better chance that it can succeed this time around.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And it's interesting to watch the state push back against cryptography and against these different technologies. Like they're continuously trying to float, both in the EU and U.S. Congress, trying to float bills through that would end-to-end encryption, um, and require companies to provide backdoors. Do you see that as something being problematic, and could that completely derail this movement?
No, but so like there's a concept in international relations called brinkmanship, and it's where states like escalate conflicts against each other further and further to try to get a favorable outcome. And that's sort of what this is doing, is the states being like, you better stop or else. And it's like, or else what? You try to backdoor these companies, you utterly fucking destroy them because nobody trusts them, and then it recreates itself, essentially in Tor and in the darknet as like a much better and more functional methodology. And like we did all this in the 90s with the original crypto wars when the state was trying to implement the Clipper chip and other things. They classified cryptography as a munition, threatened to punish anybody with severe jail times. They tried to export cryptography, but thankfully it turned out that these are just numbers. It's just speech, and courts recognize it as such. And so like I do think that perhaps there are setbacks in it, but I also think that this is an inevitable direction. And I think the sooner that people deal with it in a thoughtful way of that, like, look, the state's going to show up and try to do this, and how are we going to make a choice to organize around and against that, as opposed to just letting them destroy one's business. You know, so I guess in short of it, like maybe it'll do a temporary setback, but like you can't. This thing's out of the box. Like there's no way that you're going to destroy cryptography or take that power away from people. To me, it's very similar to trying to say like, okay, we're going to make guns illegal in America. It's like good luck. Like there's a very very well armed populace that you're going to have to figure out how to get their guns from them, and I don't see how that's going to actually be executed in a meaningful way.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like the state, in the way that they try and grow and attain more power, is through incrementalism, through a slow, steady progression. Um, and I love arguing with progressives and socialists because they argue for one, against free markets a lot of times, and then two, for uh, socialistic or democratic socialism. And one of the things I like to explain to them is that we've had socialism for a long time in the United States, and uh, it's just like what central banking creates is that type of incrementalism where all these different companies become nationalized and dependent on the government, and they're getting to pick the winners and the losers, and we're seeing a lot of that. And Bitcoin's a really interesting and cool opt out of the system. And you kind of alluded to a Friedrich Hayek quote, I think, with like the sly roundabout way of I forgot what the quote was exactly, but having to go through um, indirect, kind of sneaky ways to get around and fight the
Yeah,
state.
yep, that is definitely a reference to Hayek, and like I think kind of my lightning bolt moment of understanding it, because there was this window for me where like I was trying really hard to understand Bitcoin and cryptography, and I wasn't getting all of it. And then I picked up Hayek's The Denationalization of Money, and it just blew me away. Because I was like, well, this guy like somehow predicted all of this was going to happen. But to me, like that's really what Bitcoin is about denationalization of national currencies, and through that process, we unwind socialism, and like socialism is such like a loaded concept, because I also understand how on the left people are like, this isn't socialism at all, it's corporatism, and I agree with them, and it is well, and like this is sort of the hilarious part, is like it's this mutual fusion of socialism and corporatism in a way to where we get the worst of both worlds. And like that's pretty much exclusively been done through the banking establishment and the incrementalism that allows for them to operate as this separate arm of the US government. Like essentially banks have been deputized to enforce this entire agenda for the US government that it can't directly do itself. And essentially, like through us attacking nation state currency, uh, it's just this really powerful way across the board that allows for us to make sure that government can't, print up what $4 trillion and hand that shit out to all of its friends while not giving anything to the general public. Uh, in addition to the fact that we can also fight against this ability for the state to actually have empowerment against us. Like I think one of the most radically powerful things is once you have a substantial amount of money in Bitcoin and you secure that correctly with multi-sig or something else, like that's your money. There isn't any instant where the state can come after you in a way to extract that. And then furthermore, like, you can set up these multi-signature schemes and then have a lawyer that represents you as well, so that like if the state does come and capture you and say, hey, you're a criminal, that we can't uh, like one of the ones that worries me the most is using this enemy combatant clause within the Patriot Act to essentially capture people and deprive them of habeas corpus. At least now, uh, instead of getting all your assets and stuff seized so you can't have a meaningful fight against it, you could have a lawyer who's protecting all of your Bitcoin with this multi-signature scheme and able to draw on that wealth to at least defend you. So yeah, I do think it's a very powerful and sneaky way that we've implemented it. And to me, the most exciting thing is particularly with how much noise is going on in the whole crypto sphere with the 9,000 different blockchains that there are. It's like created such a powerful obfuscation about what's really going on. And I feel like when the state finally realizes what is going on, it's going to try to clamp down and just completely fail because it's been so behind the ball on it.
Yeah. So in you're kind of arguing that the state doesn't know what's going on. Do you?
Yeah,
Why?
I don't think
What?
they do.
Yeah. I mean, that's believable. Like when we watch Congress, talk with these tech CEOs like Dorsey or Zuckerberg, they seem to have no idea of. I watched one where a Republican House member was trying to figure or blasting the Google guy, trying to figure out why his campaign emails were going to spam. Um, and that was
You could talk to him about.
yeah, it's like 3 minutes. Um, but so I think there's a good argument for that. But when it comes to like the intelligence agencies that really pull a lot of strings and have a lot of unchecked power behind closed doors, like the NSA or whichever one, do you feel like they would be a threat potentially?
When I was at Coinbase, I worked with a guy, one of the security guys. Like he used to work for one of those three-lettered agencies, and it was funny talking to him because there was just a flat-out refusal to believe that like Bitcoin could ever kind of challenge their power. He was like, you don't understand. Like these guys are so smart, like so ahead of the ball on everything. Like there's no possible way that they could let this get around them. And I think he has a point. Like I think it's I would say it's relatively likely that Satoshi Nakamoto might have been an individual from an intelligence agency. But even if they do know these things, they're still at the behests of the leaders of the system. And like, while the whole deep state is this like really sophisticated, intelligent apparatus, it's still ran by these absolute morons in Congress and other places who, through their sheer hubris, they're sitting here asking a guy like Eric Schmidt about how their email servers are set up when they don't realize what a ludicrous question that is to even ask him. And so I think on some level, like even if the NSA is like in the background being like, look, like this Bitcoin thing's super dangerous, I could essentially see congressional people and staffers just being like, no, like this is just like a trend, like Beanie Babies or tulip bulbs. Like, get out of here. Like, it can't actually accomplish anything. And then even once it does get to this place where essentially the mask of it's ripped off, and it's turning out that this could actually really challenge the power of the state in a radical way. I just think it's too far gone at this point in time. Like we're talking about millions of people who own Bitcoin. The network's so extremely powerful and distributed across the board. It would require tens of millions of dollars investment and then more tens of millions of dollars of energy expenditure to meaningfully attack the network. And then even if you mount a 51% attack on the network, like that just means you've gotten your ladders up on the citadel. Like now you actually have to beat the thing back and defeat it, which at this point, essentially nodes are going to realize there's a 51% attack, reorganize and not recognize that node and then move forward. So frankly, like I think the things are just too far gone. Even if an intelligence agency made a fully committed effort with all of its power to attack not just Bitcoin, but like crypto on a whole and needing to defeat it, I just don't see any meaningful way that they could do that. I mean, I'm totally open to being wrong. It just seems, I just don't see how it would be accomplished.
Yeah, yeah. There was a pretty big milestone broken yesterday, or at least I saw Pomp posted on Twitter that the market cap of Bitcoin eclipsed JP Morgan's market cap, and I thought that was pretty wild. It's pretty cool. But
It is, and I think like that's part of the reason why what you were talking to earlier about us needing this reformation. I think we're at the beginning of it, because like I don't think Bitcoin's too secretive about what it's really trying to do and whose power it's trying to challenge. And people are really interested in that, and I think despite despite how much, the Facebooks and the Twitters of the world create all of this noise and they make looking out there like stuff's really bad and people are real stupid and stuff's real brutal. from the conversations that I have, like people are pretty curious and open and thoughtful and want change in a pretty radical way that isn't part of the two-party state system. And this is like a meaningful exit, you know, like watching kind of the insanity of this election go on and people being like, fuck your red guy, my blue guy's better. And they're like, no, your blue guy eats shit, I hate him. And it's like, what the fuck are you guys doing? You're never going to meet these people. They don't give a fuck about you. They're never going to come near any of your family. And they're totally invested in getting you guys to absolutely fucking hate each other. We have so much more to win together as Americans who mutually value freedom and the subjective choice of liberty and what that means to live in a peaceful society with one another where we can actually have disagreements like this and move forward and live together than in creating this other shit show of a society that they want where we viciously hate the other person simply because they have some slightly different belief from us about how governance should be done, you know. And to me, Bitcoin is much more importantly than voting. It's actually taking the money that you use to fund the state and you're saying, you know what, I would subjectively choose to put that money into this different economic system that you can't control, that you can't take advantage of, that you can't manipulate for your own purposes. And I think that's a much more powerful move. And it excites me that people seem to be understanding that message.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like in my lifetime, there's been a continuous downtrend in regards to trust for the state. Uh, it's just plummeting. What with the 2008 uh, financial crisis, and what with I don't know. I mean, the Iraq War. You go down the list. It's just bad thing after another, and then this election. What do you think it would take to really like push people over the edge and say that this is just like enough is enough? We're done with this.
To be honest with you, I don't think there's anything. I think the constant slippings that we've been seeing, to me, is part of like this general reinforcement of the state to like try to get people to like look away, look down, like don't engage, like be quiet, like know your place, stay there. And like while I think like contingencies that people would rise up and resist, like I do think it's a pretty dangerous place that we're in overall because yeah, like I honestly believe that if say there was some state of emergency declared that anybody who's ever identified as an anarchist needs to be arrested and held under these emergency laws that allow for you to be labeled an enemy combatant, like I don't expect if people were to show up at my house and black bag me that like a lot of people would make a lot of fuss about it, and I don't think that they would do that about other people either. Yeah, and it's kind of sad. And with that being said, I think we're already at the place where that small cohort of people who are outraged about what's going on have already kind of made their choice and are already making their own preparations for how they're going to fight back against the state. And I'm not sure like how that actually like meaningfully creates itself outside of Bitcoin continuing to deflate against the dollar, and essentially anybody who becomes invested in the system becoming wealthy in a way that allows for them to be self-sovereign enough to essentially remove themselves from the cities and go live in a more rural life or live with other people that have similar values.
Yeah. What do you have a website, cryptosovereignty.org.
Mm-hmm.
What It's a really cool website. What got you to go and create that? Was that your moment of trying to fight back?
Yeah, there's a couple things. Like since like 2013, I've wrote like a number of different essays anonymously, and like they're kind of around the same topic. This was still when I was moving out of some of my far left phase, so some of it deals more with Marxism and socialism. But I have a good friend who's like read all the essays. He's like, this stuff's like really, really great. He was like, at some point in time, he was like, you need to like move away from that non stuff and really like put your name on your work and take credit for it if you want to like go out there and start having meaningful dialogue with people. And I remember I thought pretty conflicted about it at the point in time, because I was like, that's going to make, poor OPSEC. It's going to make me a target for these people. Like my beliefs are pretty radical. Maybe I'll be ridiculed. Um, and so like I had left Coinbase in late 2017, and I really wanted to focus more on my writing. And I had wrote like a number of essays I hadn't published, kind of about these more kind of extreme theological ideas. And I'd been reading a lot of philosophy, and I'd sort of just finally made a decision of like, you know what, like I'm gonna just put myself out there. I'm gonna start publishing my beliefs, and if I'm attacked by people or if people ridicule me, that's fine. Like at least I get to live my own honest truth. And I found that like it was actually a lot of people were pretty welcoming towards it and open, and it gave me the motivation to keep writing more. And I found as I was doing that, I sort of discovered, I guess, what you would call sort of my own philosophical outlook about like what Bitcoin is and cryptography on a whole is. To essentially surmise it, like I do believe that these are radical liberative weapons that allow for us to radically change our circumstance in the world and choose the sort of society and economy that we want to build together. Like we no longer have to be subjected to the nation state and their fiat money and their ability to rob us, when we can choose to put our wealth in something like Bitcoin or other crypto assets and what that offers us. And I'm also like, I'm just really interested in a lot of the philosophical questions that this stuff brings up, because I feel like it's been really overlooked. And I'm by no means an expert in the area of philosophy around this. And I just hope that by writing around it, I would really welcome other people to start thoughtfully contributing to, deeper philosophical questions about, what really is the purpose of Bitcoin? Is it just about money, or is it about something else?
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the beautiful things about Bitcoin is it's paradigm shifting in so many ways. To have a basic understanding of it, you have to ask a lot of questions that people have probably never even thought of or knew existed. So, what is money? People don't think about that. What is, the idea of like interacting on a peer-to-peer basis without any sort of third party mediators. People don't really think about that. They're just thinking about convenience, like Venmo's great, or whatever. They don't think about like letting go of privacy, with debit, credit transactions, at all these different stores, and how Bitcoin can provide privacy. So yeah, it is a pretty cool paradigm shift. And so yeah, as I want to circle back. So you talked a little bit about, I think it was on Guy Swan's podcast. You talked about being kind of like a left anarchist. So what are the different branches of anarchism?
Well, there's a bunch. And I guess like if I was forced to identify, there's a form of anarchism that's called anarchism without adjectives. And essentially the idea is it tries to take this whole hodgepodge mix of anarchist ideas and says, look, let's stop labeling all of them. Like if you want to fight against the state, like we can find an alliance with you. But in terms of the different kinds, I guess if you'd say, like on the far left, you have Anarcho Communism, which is essentially the idea that you want to achieve communism through anarchism, so to do it without the state. There's Anarcho Syndicalism, which is kind of the idea of various syndicates, which are essentially trade unions, working groups, community organizations, kind of any small affinity group that creates itself, them all marrying up and allowing for themselves to kind of create these new cohorts that do mutual aid to each other. And then there's also just individual anarchists that are just like radically, you own yourself, you own your body, you own everything that happens to you. You have absolute right to do whatever you want with your body. And then I guess kind of even on the right, you'd have people like Stirner and their egoism. That's like, you know, whatever you can even manifest in this world as an individual, you can do. You know, and to me, like some of the more important ones are just exploring these topics and seeing what they have to say. And like for me personally, I think Rudolf Rocker really captures the idea of American anarchism in a very powerful way. And he was also deeply influential on Noam Chomsky as well. And I think he's able to kind of frame up the ideas of anarcho-syndicalism really well. And I think I'm trying to remember the name of like his major anarchist book, but he wrote it in response to the Spanish Civil War and what the anarcho-syndicalists were doing with the Republican forces fighting fascism during the Spanish Civil War. And I think he wrote it at the behest of Emma Goldman. She like really encouraged him to write that. And so I think that frames up a lot of the ideals of anarchism in a really powerful and thoughtful way.
Awesome. Yeah. It's you referenced Noam Chomsky, and he's I think a Tucson favorite because he's a professor at the University of Arizona here in town. But yeah, his book, what's it called? Just blanked. Manufactured Consent. Yeah. That was pretty wild. You know, that idea, and you know, there's all these like.
Well, there's a lot of point out Noam was originally a linguist. You know, and like it's really interesting that through his study of language he came to anarchism. And I just want to point that out because I do think that there's an interesting connection to the linguistic phenomenon like it is Bitcoin and the blockchain and how that also creates anarchism. But I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No worries. Yeah, that's a cool point. Yeah, yeah, so it's a kind of a weird time right now. One of the things that I found really interesting. So there's some books that are pretty popular in the Bitcoin sphere. So you know the Creature from Jekyll Island, Sovereign Individual, Fourth Turning. You know, there's all these different books that are referenced quite a bit, and they seem to be pretty prophetic as far as you know, what like their predictions coming true. So I feel like it's pretty easy to say right now that the state's going to grow bigger, the abuses are going to grow bigger, certain people groups are going to be targeted more. How do you live confidently knowing or believing these types of ideas, and just like watching them come true, and seeing the failings of the state over and over?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think part of it, one is that like realizing living outside of the state is really important. You know, and that like the state can never provide a real life of security or safety for us. Like that's all an illusion. And I got like something I've been thinking a lot about is I just finished reading this book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is about it's wrote by this radical educator Paulo Freire in Brazil in the 1970s, and he talked about doing critical consciousness raising with oppressed people to bring them awareness of their oppression. And he talks about how like that first encounter where you really start questioning things and you realize that you're oppressed is extremely difficult and scary, because like you realize that there's this entire system that is out to exploit and steal from you and wants to abuse and harm you. And a lot of people can collapse in that. But at the same time, there's also this opportunity to realize that now that you're conscious of what's occurring to you, you have the ability to learn to fight it and how to help yourself. And that through that kind of encounter of admitting to yourself the truth of how scary these things are, you can say, okay, well, I am afraid that the state's going to come after me for whatever reason at some point in time. How can I actively resist that? What can I do to protect myself and my family in a meaningful and thoughtful way? And I think things like Bitcoin allow for that. And to your point earlier that you were saying about, there are these sort of prophetic writings that are there. I think a lot of these writing components are asking many of the same questions that people are curious about and want to know more about. And through that act of questioning, people essentially arrive at the conclusion of, oh, like I can use Bitcoin to achieve self-sovereignty for myself. I can use it to run a business that operates outside of the purview of the state. I can use it to create real savings that can't get inflated by the state, nor that a bank can randomly seize for its own pleasure. And I think that admitting to ourselves that the state could do all of these very dangerous and scary things, that they are going to take more people's power, they are going to be more repressive and hurtful to people, is true. But we also have to realize that we are empowered to change that, and like that, frankly, like that is part of the entire concourse of what Americanism is about knowing that we are free people that can choose to change our circumstances accordingly, but only if we can do that. It reminds me of the Benjamin Franklin quote of when he came out of the when he came out of the Constitutional Convention, and they were like, so what form of government do we have? And he said, well, you can have a republic if you can keep it. And that's sort of the place that we're at. Our republic's being taken away from us. And it doesn't mean it has to be that way forever. We need to fight back so that we can keep it, but that's going to mean fighting back in thoughtful ways, and as much as Occupy was a fun interaction with people, I'm pretty against the idea of going out and protesting as the way to create change now. Like, I think the way to create change is to build real sustainable differences on the ground, and so whether it's collectives that do mutual aid for each other. Like one of the organizations that I really love is Food Not Bombs. Like, I think that their work is really incredible because essentially they're like, look, like everybody has a right to eat. We don't need to go get permits to do that, and we'll serve anybody food who's hungry. And I think things like that make a real difference in the world.
Yeah, they are interesting. Yeah, on the topic of protesting, I feel like it's beneficial to bring awareness to something because it makes noise, but it also is it places people in movements in a very vulnerable place where they could be easily dismantled, is what I've seen. So mob mentality is really dangerous and scary, and there's been very clear examples of police or other groups trying to exploit that. So a really good movie that just came out recently was the Chicago 7, and I thought that was really. I just thought it was really well done. Just seeing that, like, if you are doing something that's inherently good and right, you could be just completely destroyed arbitrarily because it totally goes against the interests of the powerful. And yeah, and so I that's something that brings me hope, is like kind of what you're talking about, is just like seeing where you have power and being able to identify that and to use it to do what you feel is right and better for society. And yeah, it's what brings me hope for sure, is feeling like I can make a difference I can attain a sense of meaning. I'm not just like I'm not just stuck or
Well, and
sentenced to.
I think that that feeling of stuckness, I think it's part of what this society and this form of governance imparts to us, is this deep sense of despondency and hopelessness, and nihilism too, like this idea that there is no point to any of this, that it's all dark and drab and hurtful. And to me, one of the other things about raising one's consciousness and seeing the conditions of one's own oppression to be able to fight it is also the actual spiritual connection to realize that like that whole idea of nihilism is actually false, that like we can attain a meaningful life for ourselves, but like we must create that together, and we need to strive towards that. And if we don't do those things, like we will find ourselves in a place of hopelessness, despondency, and despair. uh, and for me, I also believe that like it's through this intellectual process of being curious and raising our own consciousness and questioning things, that through this process we eventually start to realize that uh, the quest for our own freedom and achieving that becomes the meaningful thing that we can do that connects us spiritually to the world. Because through doing good things, we start to realize that like, oh, the goodness of what I'm doing in and of itself is a meaningful and purposeful thing that I can feel good about, and I can make my purpose in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So where are some good ways that people can follow your work?
Well, I like being a loudmouth on Twitter, so it's always a great place to find me on Twitter. I've been doing a lot more collaborative work recently. So the Bitcoin Times, their second edition's coming out, and I have a piece in that called "Bitcoin in the State of Emergency," which is essentially about how governments use the state of emergency to radically expand their powers and essentially oppress people, and eventually do things like conduct genocide. And how Bitcoin is actually the real state of emergency, which it's a reference to a Walter Benjamin quote that essentially, like, through Bitcoin creating this real state of emergency that challenges the state's power and has the possibility to vanquish state power without actually fighting a physical and violent war. Like, it presents itself as this radical object of hope in this kind of drab and nihilistic world. And then I also have another piece that's coming out in 21ism, which is like an art collective where they're going to be reading an essay that I titled The Hope of Bitcoin. And then other than that, I try to publish stuff on my website, cryptosovereignty.org. But I've just been really busy lately. I recently have just kind of taken on a number of new projects that I'm pretty excited about, but that's just kind of taken up a lot of my time and focus. So
Yeah, I always enjoy listening to your work on Guy's podcast.
Thank
Yeah.
you. I appreciate hearing that. And yeah, it's
Yeah.
been super cool having engagement from folks like Guy reading my essay, and yeah, I really loved my conversation with him because it was fun to go deep in some of this stuff. Because I've been in the industry for what, like, almost 8 years now, and I've learned a lot. I've gone really deep, but I'm really interested in these kind of juicy topics around philosophical discussion, like what really is Bitcoin, like, in its essence? Like, is it actually about its technology, or is it about like our relationship with it as people? And that's more and more what I think about it, is that like I think the technology is almost a secondary aspect about it. Like the fixed supply, the fact that it has cryptography baked in it, so that like other individuals we interact with are anonymous and we can't actually hold any power over them. And I find discussing and kind of teasing out these ideas really fascinating. And so I'm always really excited to get to kind of talk in depth with people about stuff like that.
Yeah, I really like that perspective a lot. I think I'm going to start using it when I describe it to people. It's
Cool. Yeah, I'm happy to hear that. Because yeah, I think like when people get so hung up on like the money part, and I want to be like, look, like, let's like set the money thing aside for a minute. Like, what does it mean to actually like own this object of wealth that has fundamental guarantees about it? Like, I know that there's no possible way that more than 21 million units of Bitcoin can be created. What does it mean that like that's a guaranteed promise that I'm assured of? Like, a government can't make that kind of promise to me. Like an institution or a bank can't make that kind of promise to me. I mean, hell, like even a religion can't make that kind of promise to me at this point in time. So what does it mean that this piece of nascent software can make that sort of promise to me and assure itself and guarantee itself, and has this 10-year history of doing that? whereas every other institution on the planet at this point in time can't make those sort of assurances to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that folds into a lot of my work about how it creates this new form of sovereignty utilizing cryptography.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, one of the coolest aspects of that is it just empowers you to be a different person in your interactions with people. So, you have all these institutions that you're relying on that can't fulfill their promises to you, which then jeopardizes your ability to fulfill your promises to other people. So, like, one of the examples I have is just like looking at all the people that have lived their entire lives relying on the idea of receiving a pension, or the idea that their retirement savings are actually going to be something, and what that means, because they may be in a position where they're supporting, a loved one, or are trying to leave some inheritance to somebody else, or donate to a cause once they pass that they feel is meaningful, that could be potentially wiped out. But when you have Bitcoin, you actually own it, and there's just so much certainty that comes with it. People talk a lot about like the volatility of it as being an issue, but I feel like the upsides of it and the certainty that comes with it outweigh the price fluctuations, because
into this idea of the volatility, sure, it's volatile, but like if you look at it over the last 10 years, it's been volatile upwards and to the right, like that's inherently what it does, and markets are going to change prices, but one of the reasons that Bitcoin is so volatile is because of the fixed price scheme of it. Like a great example to that point of the promise is that, like, I've secured in cold storage, like my children will both inherit a few Bitcoin, and like that 20 years out, whether Bitcoin's worth 0 or something, like they get that, and the network guarantees that to them in a way that even if I have a pension or I have a trust set up or a will, we just don't know what's going to happen on a macroeconomic level. Like, what happens if we do get hit hyperinflation? Like, do people still get their pensions? Does Social Security mean something anymore? Like, I'm like, this is the place that I get really scared, is that, like, most people believe these institutions to some extent and really fail to see that they can pull the rug out from under you, and there's really nothing you can do about it. And I think that that's really important because, like, not to be fear mongering, but like that's gonna happen. Like, I don't see how you can have what happened earlier this year with the creation of, $4 trillion that gets flooded into the economy, and how that isn't going to have severe affects down the line. I hope I'm wrong, but it doesn't look good from a monetary history standpoint.
Yeah, if you build a house without a roof, it's eventually going to get wet inside.
Yep.
Well, Erik, I really appreciate you coming on. Appreciate your time. It's a really fun conversation.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate having the conversation, and it's always fun to know that there's seekers out there that are looking for information, looking to learn more, and I just really appreciate folks like yourself kind of asking thoughtful questions and wanting to dig into the topic more. Because if I could impart any advice onto people that are curious about Bitcoin or crypto in general, I'd just say keep reading, keep being interested, keep thinking about it, and whether you choose it's for you or not, I think the actual information that you get and knowledge that you get imparted to you for trying to explore it is the most important part. So.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, that was a really fun conversation. Erik has just got a really strong ability to communicate very well, and he is a great writer. And I'll make sure to link his website in here, where he has a lot of his writings. But yeah, anarchism is always been very countercultural, and considered a dangerous, in quotes, dangerous ideology, because it directly challenges the state. And I think it's a really interesting one for that reason. And there's some people that have a very disproportionate impact on the world. And I think Satoshi Nakamoto, with his advent of Bitcoin and just the whole cypherpunk movement, have had huge impacts on the world. It's a very small group of people. And I think, on the inverse, people like that are involved with the Federal Reserve, or, a lot of like policy making, or, whatever, they also have a very disproportionate impact on the world. And they're kind of two warring factions, in a sense, of ideologies, of having the exact opposite ideologies of, I would argue, and I have kind of a cynical view of it, but I would argue that, the central banks are there to really make the bankers rich and keep them rich and protect them, and the government, in the same way, has kind of formed into an institution that's just supposed to protect the rich and powerful, at the expense of everybody else. And I wouldn't say I'm a full-blown anarchist yet, but conversations like this are really interesting to mull over different ideas, ideas which aren't discussed in the mainstream. And if you like what I'm doing with the podcast, I'd love your support on Patreon at the Tucson Bitcoin podcast. And it goes a long way too if you like, comment, subscribe, do that whole thing, review if you're listening to it on audio. And I'm always happy to have a conversation. You can hit me up at LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter. The Twitter is probably the best place to reach out to me, but I love to talk Bitcoin. I love to explain it. I love to help out. If you're new to the space, help you out, get you set up with a wallet, with an exchange. Love helping businesses start to accept Bitcoin. I love BTC Pay Server, but I just want to see the adoption of Bitcoin in Tucson. I'm really passionate about it. I think it can go a long way to really help a lot of people that have been traditionally disempowered. And thanks for listening.